breaking and entering, drunk and disorderly, law and order. A former prosecutor and a defence lawyer, not your typical pairing. And the result? Conversations about crime and punishment that are guaranteed to get you thinking.
Welcome to Justice Matters, a weekly podcast with Lizzie Green and Joe Crowley. Our episodes are available every Monday on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and YouTube. Follow us on Instagram and TikTok at Justice Matters Pod for clips. Enjoy the episode. This episode contains descriptions of intimate partner homicide. Listener discretion is advised. Hello, Lizzie.
Hello, Joe.
How are you?
Well, I'm very well, as usual. How are you?
I am well. So you communicated to me that one of our avid listeners wanted to hear about the case of Henry Kio.
Yes.
From South Australia.
I know. Well, and look, it is a good one.
It is a good one, and I can speak about it with some level of authority since I represented Keogh for a time, not for the entirety of his legal wranglings.
Yes, well, my student was very excited to hear that.
Yeah.
So we're all on edge to hear your expert assessment of the case.
Wow, okay. Well, my expert assessment of the case was absolutely botched from start to finish by the police and the chief forensic pathologist in South Australia. But let's jump into that.
Let's.
Okay. So in March of 1994, another old case, a young bank executive, I think he's in his early 30s, Henry Kio, arrives home at the house he's living in with his fiancée, Anna Chaney or Anna Shinny, and finds her in the bath dead.
Not what you want to come home to.
No, he immediately pulls her out of the bath, calls the ambulance, starts CPR. She's got some vomit in her mouth that he's got to clear out, and he starts working on trying to revive her. The ambulance officers arrive. He is very distressed. They try to, I think, revive Anna Shinny, but by that stage it's quite clear that she's dead. The ambulance officers don't think that there is anything suspicious. On her body, there is no injuries that would be consistent with sort of defensive, with a struggle. And Henry Kio himself, again, doesn't have injuries on his body that would be sort of defensive injuries. There are some small bruises on Anna Shinny's shin, which I'll talk about in a second, but nothing that the people on the night think is suspicious. And I always think that's a huge red flag. So you might recall in the Chamberlain case, Lindy Chamberlain, she's camping at Uluru with her husband and their 3 young children, including baby Azaria. And she's at the barbecue area and has put her children to sleep in the tent some meters away. And she's chatting amiably with the people at the barbecue area, and then hears something and sees something in the tent and goes over and then calls out, "A dingo's got my baby." And none of the people who were actually there on the night in relation to Lindy Chamberlain thought anything other than that Azaria was taken by a dingo and that Lindy was innocent. And that all got lost, obviously, in that Lindy's trial because she's eventually convicted. Similarly here, the people who attend on the night, the ambulance officers who are the first responders, I think the police later attended, nobody thought that there was anything suspicious, but that this young woman in her late 20s had died in her bath, had drowned, was the assumption.
So 2 questions.
Yep.
Did you say she was already dead when the paramedics arrived?
Yeah. The reason I didn't say she was definitely dead is because officially, in a legal sense, and we are trying to be legal. They couldn't declare it. Yeah, they at some point have to declare death. So up and until that point, legally, you're not dead. But I think the reality is that she was dead. She was dead, I think, when Henry got home.
Okay, and you said he was a young banker.
Young banking executive.
So when the paramedics came,
yes,
did they pay attention to what he was wearing? Was he in a suit or something?
So this is 9:00 at night. So what had happened earlier in that evening? So they lived together. They were engaged to be married. They had finished work and gone out for a drink, had a glass of wine each, I think, and eaten some potato wedges. So back in the early 90s, remember what a hit potato wedges were?
Yeah, still are, I think.
Yeah. And then they'd gone home together. About 8:00, Henry had gone to visit his mother, who lived nearby, and Anna Shinny had gone out for a walk with her sister with their dog. So what are we talking about? March in in Adelaide. I assume the son stays up late or whatever. So she walks with her sister in the park. And she had said to Henry when he was leaving at 8 o'clock that night, "Oh, I'm going to have a bath, whatever, when I get home." Or maybe she'd already been for a walk. Anyway, so he comes back at a bit after 9 o'clock, or about around 9:30, and then he finds her and she's dead in the bath.
So it was between 8 and 9 p.m.
Last seen alive, yeah. There's nothing particularly strange about the case until it gets into the hands of a man called Dr. Colin Mannock. And he is, I think now, certainly notorious, mostly for his work on the Keogh case, but it's fair to say that he had bungled many cases before that. Well, certainly several, let's say several.
I think you could say many.
Certainly there's question marks over a number of the high-profile autopsies that he did. So he is tasked as the chief forensic pathologist to do the autopsy on Anna Anishini's body. He comes up with, he admits to believing that this was in fact a murder, and he was encouraged in that view because of the brides in the bath case from the early 20th century. Have you heard of the brides in the bath case?
Not that I can recall.
No. Okay. So this is an interesting case. I actually only sort of vaguely knew the details of it, but for the purposes of this podcast, I went and had a look more of the details. And the similarities are really quite striking.
Is it Australian?
Not Australian, English case.
Okay.
So a guy called George Smith, well, I think his real name was George Smith because he had a lot of pseudonyms.
Right.
He was...
Which is always a red flag.
Yeah, big red flag. He was a serial bigamist. So he liked to go around marrying women. But it seems that he did that for their money. Yeah. And then he obviously at some point got a taste for disposing of them once he had got the money.
Maybe he didn't like being a bigamist, so he wanted them dead. So he was free to marry the next one.
Free to marry the next one. That would work if he didn't overlap in his marriages, but his marriages did tend to overlap.
Ah, okay.
So I think in all he was married 7 times.
That is excessive.
He was only convicted of murdering 3 of his wives. I think the other 4 weren't killed.
Right.
But what he would do is he would marry a woman and then spend her money. And I think he said he was a travelling salesman, so he would just go to another town further away, have a different name, marry a different woman.
Oh, my goodness. I always think when I hear things like that, the mental toll of trying to keep up with all of your lies and keeping everything hidden,
all the balls in the air,
it would not be worth it.
No. But this is back in the day, obviously before mobile phones, probably before telephones, early 20th century.
Yes.
And so your ability to sort of disappear and really be uncontactable.
Much easier. Yes. Find my phone.
No, exactly. So what happens is, I can't remember which. So he certainly one of the details of one of the deaths of one of his wives I'll go into, and I think this is the one that sort of starts to unravel the whole story for him. So he and his wife move to a town. They rent a room in a sort of a lodging house, or a series of rooms in a lodging house, and they're living there for a few weeks. 2 things happen while they're there. After a while, they hire a bathtub.
Okay.
Because the room there doesn't have a bathtub.
What do you mean they hire a bathtub?
I don't know.
So it's obviously not plumbed in.
I don't know. But I mean, I'm thinking this is not a business we have nowadays, hiring bathtubs. I think there might be an opening there. I might start a bathtub.
Who's hiring? No one's hiring a bathtub, Joe.
Anyway,
maybe an ice bath.
George Smith does back in the day. So he hires a bathtub. At the same time, he also takes his then wife, to the doctor, saying that she was an epileptic. The wife herself only complained of headaches. The doctor on one visit can't make any particular determination, but, says, come back in a week or something, take 2 Panadol and call me in the morning. Anyway, the next the doctor hears is that the patient, the wife, had died by drowning in the bath. And the husband, George Smith, he was using a different name at that point, but he had said, he comes in, his wife's dead in the bath, obviously, after having an epileptic fit.
Oh, convenient.
Very convenient. completely believed by everybody, and it was just the doctor signed off on it, death by drowning, epilepsy.
What?
Yeah. That actually wasn't. That was one of the cases that came to light later, because a similar thing happens. He's, again, in a lodging house. This one had a bathtub in it.
He didn't have to hire it.
Didn't have to hire the bathtub. And, again, he reports that his wife has drowned in the bath.
Because of epilepsy?
No, that one wasn't because of epilepsy. And it wasn't. It was because, again, a forensic pathologist took an interest in the case and couldn't determine. They determined that the woman had drowned in the bath, but they couldn't. There was no real evidence of anything else that happened to them.
To why?
Yeah, and one small bruise on their leg, I think, was it. And they said the deaths seemed to be quite instantaneous. I don't know how in the early 20th century they're determining that.
Maybe it's how much fluid was in the lungs or something.
Well, what I learned a lot from this case, and one of the things that I learned is fluid in the lungs is not necessarily a indication of drowning, because your lungs fill up with edema. I don't even know what that is. Some
Isn't
kind of
that
fluid
blood?
in the body. I don't know. After death for a whole range of different deaths. So fluid on the lungs is not necessarily an indication of drowning.
So maybe it's more that if there is no fluid in the lungs, you haven't drowned.
Yeah, maybe.
Trying to think back to my many crime novels where
yes.
they use that sort of evidence.
Yes. So, back to Brides in the Bath case, this forensic pathologist is a bit curious about this case, and then gets wind of the earlier drowning case, which had happened a couple of years earlier with the epilepsy in the bath, sends a picture of the guy who he's got, George Smith, to the local police. They say, oh, yeah, that's, Barry Jones, or whatever he called himself. And then they start to connect them together. They end up connecting that this man has on 3 occasions had his wife die in the bath. And there's no way to work out how the women died except insofar as they say they're drowning. So this forensic pathologist does some tests. He gets a bath. One of the things that really alerted him is the bathtubs were too big to lie out in completely. So if you're lying in the bath, your legs are actually sticking out the other end.
So too small.
Sorry, too small. Too small. So he felt that was a bit of an odd way for somebody to drown in a bath that
you
they
couldn't
can't
even
really
fully lie down in.
So the forensic pathologist does some tests and gets, interestingly, a female police officer. This is, again, back in the early 20th century. Female police officer who comes on, oh, no, I think she was an expert in diving or something. Anyway,
right.
Interesting job for one would have thought, for a woman in the early 20th century. And puts her in the bath, and then does a whole lot of scenarios about how she might have drowned. And he does things like tries to push her underwater, and she can, keep her head above water and struggle against it. So because there's no wounds on these women, he assumes there's no struggle.
Hold on. Was there the availability of toxicology? Like, did they know if they had drugs in their system?
Yeah, good point. So they say there's no drugs in their system. But again, we did our episode on the mushroom
killer.
Well, is she? She hasn't been tried yet.
The mushroom potential killer.
And I talked in that episode how difficult it often is to work out the way that somebody died through toxicology. And this is the early 20th century, so I suspect it was pretty rudimentary. Right. But certainly they said no drugs that they could detect in the system.
Okay.
But what happened is the forensic pathologist at one point, so they're doing these tests, this female expert diver is lying in the bath, and he grabs her feet and pulls them towards him, pulling her underwater. And what apparently happened then is the water rushed up her nose and she wasn't ready for it, into her mouth, and she immediately passed out and was underwater. And he had to pull her out of the bath and then revive her effectively.
What?
Yeah. This is apparently the story. It all sounds a bit weird to me.
That sounds very weird.
It does. But anyway, this forensic pathologist concludes that this is how George Smith killed his wives. He, while they were lying in the bath, pulled their feet very quickly and that took their head underwater, and they then got a mouthful of water, a nose full of water, and that then they went unconscious and then drowned in the bath. And that explains the lack of injuries.
You can sort of picture that, can't you?
Yeah.
And I wonder then maybe you just push down on the chest once
they're
under.
If they're passed out, that would be easy. There'd be no struggle.
Resistance.
So Colin Mannock, cut to the 1994 in Adelaide. Yeah.
Was George
Smith was convicted of all 3. They tried them all at the same time. Hanged.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was one of the early similar fact evidence cases. There was objection to the evidence of the deaths of one of the women being used in the trial of the other.
Well, I imagine it would have been really tricky if they were run
I think,
separately.
yeah. Well, they were all run together. He gets convicted, appeal unsuccessful, hanged.
And hanged. Do you think he was guilty?
I don't know enough about the case, but that forensic evidence does sound a bit odd.
Hmm.
Anyway, it's even odder in the case of Henry Kio.
Yeah, so come back to
So
Dr.
Dr.
Manick.
Colin Manick, let's give him his title.
Dr.
Colin Manick. He actually was a doctor. He did not actually have an expertise in forensic pathology, which is a specialist area of medicine, which he had never done the learning and the tests for. He was given the job in Adelaide, and the Society of Forensic Pathologists or whatever, I think, granted him the qualification, even though he'd never.
Sorry, was there no one who'd done the study who could do the job?
Apparently not. He gets the job in Adelaide in the 60s or something. And he'd been there for 30 years, and he'd just botched a lot of cases.
Well, there was a gap in the market if you wanted a good job.
Yeah. Well, he'd come from England. He was English, so he knew about the brides in the bath case. And so he sees this and says, this is a brides in the bath case. This guy has murdered his fiancée in the bath. Similar in that there's no wounds on the body, no signs of a struggle, except these, it's like 4 small bruises on Anna Sheeney's shin on one of her legs, and on the other side on her calf or bottom of her calf, there's another bruise. And Colin Manick says this is evidence of the fingers of Henry Kio being along the shin bone and the thumb gripping the leg on the other side, and that what he has done is he's similar to George Smith in the Brides in the Bath case. Rather than pull her legs forward, has lifted her legs up, forcing Sheeney's head under the water in the bath, and that's how he had drowned her without causing any other injury and without her struggling.
So, I mean, my first thought is it takes a lot to bruise your legs. Like I have hit my shin numerous times on various things, mainly when I'm trying to avoid toys on the floor back in the day. And you do not always even get a bruise from that. Like sometimes you do, but then you notice it and you're like, God, that was a really bad bang. So how hard would you have to be holding someone's leg to leave such clear bruise marks?
Yeah.
And for how long?
Good point. I learned so much about stuff from this case. One of the other things I learned about this case is it's really hard to age a bruise, to work out when a bruise had occurred.
I thought the colours did that.
Well, but you've got to. So for these bruises to be relevant, they have to have been inflicted shortly before death. Okay, because he grabs her leg, she's alive. He holds the leg up, she goes underwater and dies.
Oh, and then it doesn't develop further.
Yeah, well, you do it apparently by taking a cross section of a cutting effectively of the bruise and looking at it under a microscope.
Really?
And there's something called hemosiderin, I think it's the name of it, which is some kind of chemical which appears at some point during bruising.
Wow.
But what they could never discount, which is unbelievable, is that they didn't occur after death. So her body is picked up by the ambulance officers, put onto a gurney, taken out, presumably picked up off the gurney at some point, put onto, other trays or slabs. Well, they could never account for the fact that the bruising didn't occur then. Now, bruising sort of happens differently after death because obviously your heart's not pumping anymore. But it doesn't mean you can't bruise, you still can. And so they could never prove that it didn't happen after death. And they could actually never prove when the bruises occurred. So, there's a real flaw in the case right there.
Did anybody notice the bruises when they first arrived at Keogh's house?
No, they didn't. The first time the bruises are recorded is at the autopsy. And in fact, there was a dispute about whether the bruise on the other side of the leg, the thumb bruise, there's a dispute about whether they ever existed. So there were black and white photographs taken of the legs of Anna Sheeney, and you can see, I've seen the photos, the bruising, the 3 sort of 4 bruises along the shin.
Yeah.
But there's a photo which says, bruise of you can't see anything on the photo.
I am really stuck on this shin bruising.
Yeah, it's weird, isn't it?
I cannot see how fingers are bruising. Do you mean along the shin bone?
Along the shin bone. And even if you could do it with your pointer finger, and tall man, whatever you call your
Middle finger.
middle finger.
Yeah.
You can see I've got kids. Because they're quite strong. I mean, you've also got to be putting that, of course, in your pinky, which is a very weak
Yeah,
finger.
I feel like that's quite a stretch.
I know, bizarre.
Anyway.
Well,
Colin was convinced.
He was convinced. And so that's really the central part of the prosecution case. The forensic pathologist says this is what happened. This is how the murder occurred. Yeah, based on these bruises.
That's the main evidence.
Sorry, he then determines that she's died by drowning, which he didn't do enough testing to actually determine. Because what it turned out later is that she was, there was some evidence that she had, she was allergic to things, and she
respiratory issues.
Yeah, might have actually had some kind of anaphylactic reaction. The other thing they couldn't properly discount, because he didn't do a proper autopsy, and then the body was cremated. The other thing they could never discount was that she fainted in the bath and drowned, just slipped under the water and drowned. And fainting in the bath, particularly after you've done exercise and drunk alcohol and are dehydrated, is not as uncommon as you think.
Yeah. And
one of the annoying things about this is the prosecutor's closing address to the jury was, healthy young women don't just die. And he has absolutely no evidentiary basis for saying that, because when you actually look at the statistics, more healthy young women and men die just unexpectedly than you think. And so, it's again one of these cases where I think prosecutors say things which it's completely inappropriate to say.
So you're back to
for those
not defending.
Yes, for those who've listened to our episode on the Barrable murders, I always found myself in the unenviable position of defending the police and prosecutors.
Okay, but so are you honestly telling me that this prosecution case was based on these bruises and the evidence of Manock?
Correct. Well, so the High Court had actually named Manock in a case and talked about how his evidence was unreliable.
Before this time?
Oh, it gets worse. Yeah. Specifically named him, so that he had to have his work, even though he's the chief forensic pathologist, he always had his work checked after that by another forensic pathologist.
Oh my God.
So
why didn't they just get rid of him?
Well, I think they couldn't, because there were some problems about his contract of employment, and they were worried they were going to sue him.
Wow.
Besides the fact that he was a good Crown man, he always used to give the police exactly what they wanted, except in another case another couple of cases. So as the forensic pathologist, he dealt with unexplained deaths, and he had looked at the deaths of several babies over the preceding years leading up to the case of Henry Kio. And he had determined that the babies had died from bronchial problems, pneumonia, despite the fact that the babies' bodies were covered in bruises. And he hadn't done that once. He'd done that, I think, on 3 or 4 occasions, to the point where the police got so upset they got a coroner to run an inquest into all of the babies. It's called the baby death inquiry. And that coroner concluded that Manock was completely incompetent in the way he had conducted the autopsies.
Wow.
But it gets worse than that. Henry Kio's tried once. Jury couldn't agree.
So a hung jury.
26-day trial. They then retry him, 15-day trial, and they get a conviction. The coroner has his findings in relation to Colin Manock and the baby deaths case, and deliberately doesn't deliver the findings until after the jury have come back in Keogh's case.
What?
Yeah. So after Keogh's convicted.
How do you know?
I mean, how do I know? It's a matter of public record.
No. How do you know that it was a deliberate delay?
Oh, I think that's everyone just accepts that. I think the coroner said, I'm just going to wait till.
But I don't understand, because the coroner's found that Manock was wrong.
Incompetent.
So why would he be delaying the results of that?
Well, I didn't want to interrupt the trial of incompetent Colin Manock in relation to Henry Kio.
But that's so contradictory. He's made a finding on one hand, but he's trying to keep it a secret.
Yeah.
Are you sure?
I'm absolutely positive. There's been 2 books written on this case.
But are you sure the coroner had that malicious intent? I'm named in one of
the books too. I just want to put
that. Oh my goodness. It's not about you,
John. Well, it sort of is. Anyway, so unbelievable. So he's convicted at the second trial. I think I mentioned that. So they did have another doctor, Dr. James, so Colin Manock gives his testimony, and then Dr. James comes along and also gives his testimony saying, oh yeah, look, I checked everything Manock did and he's right. So the jury hear two experts,
Okay.
which I just think is a weird way to
do
do
we
it.
think that Dr. James did believe Dr. Manock was right?
I think he did, even though it turned out
To be very wrong.
to be very wrong.
Mm.
Yeah.
And to think, so I'm sure you're going to take us through it all, but if George had not killed his wives,
I know.
it would not have been in Dr. Manock's head.
The Brides in the Bath case.
Correct.
I know. Although I was struck by how similar the manner of sort of the facts surrounding the case were in terms of the Brides in the Bath. Because, I mean, I knew that Colin Manock, because he'd admitted to it, was encouraged by the Brides.
No, but if they had never had that case.
I know. Where would you go?
Maybe this would never have happened to Keogh.
No. And another problem with it as a wrongful conviction is, in some wrongful conviction cases, it's clear the person has been murdered. They have blunt force trauma to the head. That's not a suicide.
Yes.
This is a case they're really hard to unpick because there actually is no crime. In fact, Anashini just has something happens as an anaphylactic reaction,
it's not obvious.
faints, drowns in the bath. There actually is no crime. And then they sort of retrofit a crime on top of it. So it's actually much harder to undo.
Well, I mean, you say there is no crime, but I think what we need to say is there was no clear crime.
No, it's totally not a crime. I mean, he's been acquitted now.
Right.
So, well,
as a starting point, though.
Oh, you don't want me to give the ending away? Oh, geez, sorry, man. Spoiler.
Well, I mean, there are times that victims appear to have not been subject to violence or whatever, but they've still been murdered.
Yes.
So I think we need to...
Sure, but this isn't a case where the person might have committed suicide or the person clearly has been killed by somebody. It's a case where the person just died accidentally.
Yeah, yes.
So, I mean, even suicide cases can be difficult if a person has committed suicide and then somebody's charged with their murder. But this is a case where there's no evidence of suicide, no evidence of any kind of a crime until Colin Manock comes in with his
ideas,
yes, speculations, let's call them.
All right. So what year is that trial that he gets convicted?
That's 94, 95.
Had he been in custody waiting for...
No. He had been out. So let me say a couple of other things about the trial. I should say that Henry Kio was married and then separated from his wife but not yet divorced and had two children, two young daughters. Now, he had a good relationship with his ex-wife, and so he would see her and see his daughters reasonably regularly. He then was in a relationship with Anashini and he was engaged to marry her.
Right.
So the prosecution, looking to shore up a pretty weak case, they go hunting for other evidence. So they pull out two pieces of evidence which I would have absolutely objected to, because they don't go to anything except motive. They don't actually go to proving the murder. So the first thing they do is they find two women who Henry Kio said he only had flirtations with, but both the women said that he had sexual relations with. In the couple of years before, in the 18 months, 2 years before Anashini's death.
While he was with Anna?
While he was with her.
Okay.
Yes. And...
Was he married to any of them?
No, he wasn't married to any of them. So they have these women come along and give what's called relationship evidence. I don't know if I've said it before on this podcast, but I'm going to throw it out there now. Relationship evidence, always a huge red flag for me. I just think it is what is mostly, it seems to me, an opportunity for character assassination.
Isn't it quite difficult to get admitted?
It is. Well, not in South Australia, apparently.
Well, back then, but certainly now, isn't it?
Certainly there are rules around the admission of it, because it has to, so in a criminal trial, you can't attack the character of the accused person unless their good character, has been made an issue.
Yeah.
But and relationship evidence, as we said just before, doesn't go directly to proving the actual murder.
Crime.
It goes to setting the scene.
The type of person
yeah.
they are.
And it's usually used in these cases of intimate partner homicide because you want the jury to understand what the relationship between the couple was like to then put into context whatever the behaviour is.
Yes.
So, I mean, it does have a place, but I think you've got to be very careful using it. And the cases I've seen where relationship evidence has been used are mostly miscarriage of justice cases, where I think it's just completely inappropriate.
So that was the situation here.
Yes, they pull out these two women who come along, and these are two scorned women.
Did they know each other?
No, they didn't know each other, and there did seem to be maybe some crossover between the two of them. And
these busy men. Good
Lord.
Lord.
He said he never had any sexual intercourse with them. He said he did have flirtations with them and would go out to coffee and that kind of stuff.
I imagine back then that would be an odd thing for a woman to exaggerate. Like, in a more conservative time, for a woman to say there was a sexual relationship when there wasn't would be
94, isn't it? No, it's not that dark.
Oh, 90. I thought it was 60s.
No,
that's when Manic got.
Manic, was employed in the 60s.
Oh,
but
sorry.
In the 90s, he's still in the job.
Free love.
Free
Off
love.
we go.
Yeah, we're right.
Yeah.
But I always wondered, like, if you called, a few of my ex-girlfriends and asked them the question. I mean, of course, you're going to come out of that looking terrible, aren't you? Yeah, I mean, you really are, aren't you?
No, I married David.
I
was 17.
There you go.
Not when I got married.
No, just to be clear.
But I've got no unpleasant exes.
Yeah. See, I just think that if you are going to get a guy or a girl and call their exes to give evidence about them, you're probably going to get some
You're not going to hear the best things, presumably.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
So they do that. They do a good, nice, healthy dose of character assassination because what they're trying to show is that, in fact, Henry Kio wasn't going to marry Anna Chaney.
He wanted her dead.
Dispose of her. And then they need a motive for that as well, and they get the insurance policies.
Oh.
I think I've mentioned on a podcast that we've done how skeptical I am of insurance policy as a motive for murder stuff.
I think you're skeptical of anything which tends to implicate guilt.
Yeah, pretty much. Anyway, so what happened? So Henry Kio is working as a bank clerk, bank executive clerk or something. He's working at the bank. What was common at the time was for people to have a side hustle, these kind of people to have a side hustle selling insurance policies. And so you had to have some kind of license to sell insurance policies. And one of the criteria on the license is you couldn't just have it and then not sell insurance policies. You had to actually be selling, one insurance policy every couple of months.
Meet your targets.
Yeah. It was his own business. It was a side hustle outside of his work for the bank.
But to make it viable.
Yeah, although it wasn't a money-making venture at that point, but he wanted to keep the license to sell insurance policies as a sort of a option in case he wanted to leave the bank.
Okay.
So he had to be selling insurance policies and paying, and those policies having the premiums paid on him to keep his license. So what he does is he takes out insurance policies on easy people to sell them to. He takes them out on Anna Chaney. He takes them out on his ex-wife. He takes them out on himself. He takes them out on his children. So he's got about...
And he's paying all of the premiums.
And he's paying all of the premiums on about like 15 insurance policies.
Oh, my goodness.
I know. And this is in the sort of 18 months, 2 years leading up to Anna Chaney's death. And so what the prosecution say is, or what he's doing is, he is now setting it up so that when she dies, he then inherits money. And so they had this tagline. He wanted to... have the life he wanted and the means to have that life or something, and it was all about he's going to collect this massive insurance payout and be able to then go off with one of his other girlfriends.
Okay, so I understand.
Yes,
he has been found innocent.
Yes.
So I'm just going to question about the motive. Like, you don't think financial gain is a motive?
Financial gain is obviously a motive, but my point is that unless you can really demonstrate that there's actually been a murder, then you don't even get to motive. Like motive doesn't prove murder.
All right.
I mean,
but
I've got
you're
motive to kill a number of people. I'm sure you have too.
Oh, but you're going to say me for a
No,
minute.
of course not. I'm my co-host. Just because you have a motive to kill somebody.
No, all right. But so when you just said a massive payout, like what are we talking?
Oh, $250,000 or something. I mean, this is the
so not
early
millions.
90s. No.
And if it was in the 18 months to 2 years leading up to the death, then why, and there were so many, why was it suspicious?
Well, most of them were for Anna Sheeny. I think
he had multiple ones.
Yeah. Yeah, I said there was 15. I only named 4 people he took them out on. Yeah,
I thought you were just giving me examples of the types of people he took them out on.
No, there was only those people. But most of them were Anna Sheeny. Some of them were for him and Anna Sheeny. Some of them were just her. Some of them were for him, I think. Some of them, and then I think there's one for his ex-wife.
Yeah, that is a bit odd.
Well, sure, but his explanation is, well, I had to keep, selling these policies, and so a way to do that was to effectively buy them myself.
And so was Anna paying any of the insurance premiums?
No, I think he was paying them all. There was some question about whether she knew, and there was some evidence that she knew about some of them, but not all of them. So that he'd taken out some policies on life that she didn't really know about. Again, I mean, in the face of his explanation, he has a rational explanation to.
I have to say, if I found out today,
yes,
that David had taken out multiple life insurance policies on me, I'd be like, why?
Interesting.
Well, do you not think that, I mean, I know that was his job. I'm just being devil's advocate.
Sure.
Because at this point, they're still investigating, I'm assuming, and finding out this information.
Yeah. The problem with the investigation is they start with
it's retrospective.
Yeah, and they start with the end in mind. So they go, oh, this is a murder. Let's go and look for evidence that supports our theory.
I can understand why you would think that was like a little...
Sure. I mean, in investigation, by all means, let's chase every rabbit down its burrow. My objection is that it goes in at the trial. I mean, I just think that it should have just been... The problem is if all of that evidence stays out, all I've got is Colin Manock and Dr. James with his...
Okay, but so apart from Manock and the insurance, what did you say the other thing was?
Manock, the insurance,
and the women.
The relationship of the women.
Okay. All right.
The other thing that they do, which I would have totally objected to, is they allow Colin Manock to demonstrate this cause of death and the manner of death in the courtroom. So they get a bathtub, they put it in the middle of the court, and they get him to come in, and they get somebody lying in the bath, and he shows how you pull one leg up and there.
Did he bruise her leg?
Yeah, no, I don't think so. But I have a friend who lived in Adelaide during this trial, and she recalls, she has a young person, that one of the newspapers did a double-page fold-out spread of a drawing of how he did the murder, and it has this method of death, in big, So you can see how powerful that kind of evidence is. I'm always skeptical of demonstration evidence. I think you've got to be very careful of it.
That's crazy,
isn't it?
Oh, I wonder if they hired the bath.
Yeah, did they rent the bath? They must have, probably from the same people that George Smith did.
Can't you imagine the journalists, though, who are so used to just doing little sketches of witnesses to have this bath and the demonstration? You would want a double spread.
Yeah, the court artist is like, finally something.
Yeah, something to draw. Yeah.
So he's convicted on the second trial. And then shortly after that, the coroner's report in the baby deaths inquiry comes out showing that Colin Manock was...
So surely that's new.
Yeah, so he's like, wow, this is amazing. He appeals unsuccessfully. Very typical in a miscarriage of justice case. Your first appeal fails.
On the basis of Manock's evidence?
On the basis, yes, that the evidence... So they don't know at that stage how wrong Manock's evidence is.
Okay.
But they do know that there's some aspects of it that are wrong, or that he couldn't properly exclude other causes of death or things like that. But I think primarily on the idea of the baby deaths inquiry, and that if the defence barrister had that, absolutely would have cross-examined Dr. Manock in it. And I think the Court of Appeal was like, well, the problem is that Dr. James said Manock was right, so what are you complaining about?
Okay.
So from then on, there's a couple of legal missteps. I wasn't involved in the case at this time. So what they do is they then put in so they've appealed to the state's appeal court and lost. They then put in a petition of pardon to the governor and appeal to the High Court
At the same time.
at the same time. And so what do you reckon happens? The High Court goes, you've got a petition of pardon in, why don't you just wait for that? The pardon goes, I see you're in the High Court, just wait for that. Neither of them make a decision in his favour.
But so did they both dismiss them?
Yeah, they dismissed it.
On the basis
the reasoning
of the other
was,
one. Okay.
yes.
Yeah, that was
And
silly.
again, so that's just bad lawyering, I think.
Yeah.
Bad lawyering. So he then has exhausted his opportunities of appeal and he's lost on a pardon petition. So he then brings another appeal in the State Court of Appeal, which you can't do.
A subsequent.
Yeah, because then so they say, well, this matter's been decided. You can't have a second appeal.
You can now.
You can now, and because of this case, and so that goes out.
Oh, right, okay.
Anyway, so then this enormous saga of decade, 15 years or more begins in trying to overturn his conviction. What happens is in the early 2000s, so just under 10 years later, Four Corners gets involved, and they do a program on Colin Mannock and how incompetent he is.
Really?
Yeah. And then,
so he was still practicing all that time?
Oh, I think he'd retired by that stage, but a number of cases that he'd been involved in besides Henry Kio
had come to light.
Yeah, and there was real question marks over his decisions in those cases.
Yeah.
Apparently on one occasion he did an autopsy. He went to a small country town where there'd been an unexplained death and did the autopsy in the town square so everybody could watch.
I did hear that. So I think I gave a shout out to my student in one of our earlier episodes, Matthew, but he was talking to me about Colin Mannock.
Yeah.
And I think he told me that, but he's
that's just so inappropriate. I don't want to talk about what you do to a body in an autopsy.
But who wants to watch that anyway?
You'd have to be some kind of
psychopath. But yeah, so I think his list of,
insanities,
bad choices and incompetence is lengthy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It gets worse in that, Today Tonight, Channel 7's Today Tonight in Adelaide gets on board, and they then over the course of, a decade.
Mannock.
Yeah, well, in favour of Henry Kio, run a number of stories, including paying experts to do experiments to work out whether different aspects of the evidence of trial were right or not, and they get a number of leading experts to say, look, what went on in that autopsy was wrong. You can't make that conclusion based on that evidence. That's right. They'd got a body mechanics person in to say, if you lifted the leg of that person, they wouldn't go like that anyway. And
really,
yeah, they really attacked every aspect of the prosecution.
Okay, but so what makes these experts ones that you like?
Well, again, they are actual experts. So they don't go and get, they go and get the person who works in the Melbourne University, School of Forensic Pathology and is the dean to look at it and then so they're genuine experts. And they look at things like aging and bruising, but they also look at how you determine whether somebody is drowned. And I know this because I have to read the reports and I'm aware.
Yes.
I didn't realise that. So what they do, that's the media is really behind Henry Kio. So then they've got to put in for they've got to try and get it back into the court. So they put in another petition of pardon. Now, for some reason, I think probably because South Australia is a small town, the Labor government down there was absolutely against him and decided he was definitely guilty, he wasn't getting out. So the petition of pardon goes to the Attorney General. So the Attorney General, while that's being considered, gets up in Parliament after the Four Corners program runs and says how disgraceful it is Four Corners have run that program and how Henry Kio is definitely guilty.
Oh,
and that's
my
the decision
goodness.
maker on the petition that's before him. Yeah.
Ah,
so
it's problematic.
Surprise, surprise, they lose. It gets even worse. We didn't find this out till the 2014.
He's still in prison all this time.
He's in prison all that time. The Attorney General goes to the Solicitor General, the chief sort of lawyer, and asks the Solicitor General to do a review of the case. The Solicitor General calls in the chief scientist, the South Australia's chief scientist,
right,
and says to the South Australian chief scientist, can you look at this stuff that Colin Mannock's done? And can you tell me whether it's right? And the chief scientist comes out and goes, he cannot make those conclusions based on what he found. He should have done all of this other stuff, which he didn't do. None of his conclusions are supportable.
Was that in written form?
In written form.
Wow.
Guess what the Solicitor General does with that?
Oh, please tell me.
Puts it in a drawer, closes the drawer.
No.
Yeah. Yep.
Why?
Well, the Solicitor General believed, and I think this has probably not been firmly decided, that they have no duty of disclosure.
But why would he want to? I don't understand. As a wholehearted prosecution-focused person.
Mm.
There is no part of me that would want to continue a miscarriage of justice if it came to my attention. Like, who are these people who have sworn to uphold the law and to serve justice who are saying, oh, let's just forget about that person who's wrongly convicted?
Well, you could ask him. He's now the Chief Justice of South Australia.
Right.
So what happens is the Solicitor General changes because that Solicitor General gets appointed to the court. The new Solicitor General comes in and Keogh's lawyers are talking to him and he says to them, I have a document which I'm happy to show you, but I want you to sign an undertaking that you won't show it to the media. And his lawyers at that time said, no, we are not going to sign that undertaking.
Was that the document?
That is the document.
How did he get it?
He's the new Solicitor General. He opens the drawer, presumably goes, oh, what's this?
Oh, it was just left there.
Oh, I mean, I'm making a metaphor about putting it in a drawer. But I mean,
why wouldn't he have destroyed it? The first guy.
I don't know. I don't think I think his view was, I have no legal obligation to disseminate this, to disclose this. I don't think he was deliberately trying to make sure an innocent man stay in jail. He just was like, well, the guy's been validly convicted. I have evidence
on wrong evidence.
Yeah, which is wrong evidence, sure. But I mean, doesn't mean he's not guilty. Maybe he's still guilty. I don't have any duty to disclose. I'm not going to disclose it.
I find that a really hard line to accept.
So the new Solicitor General comes in, makes this offer to the lawyers. Those lawyers say they're not going to sign the undertaking not to show it to the media.
Why?
A couple of years later, those lawyers go out. New lawyers come in, one of them being me.
Yeah.
I hear about it, I go, absolutely, I'll sign that undertaking. Let me see this. We see it, and we're like, shut the gate. This is fantastic. This is what we've been waiting for. By that stage, the new right of a further appeal had been enacted in South Australia because of the people supporting Henry Kio and their push and their complaints about the petition system where the Attorney General had clearly prejudged it. And now that we find out the Attorney General knew that there was significant problems with the scientific evidence and had still rejected the petition.
Crazy.
And so that then leads to the impetus of them passing this legislation, which is terrible legislation. But it gives him the second right of appeal. But then I was part of a small part of a larger team that then had to go through the courts arguing that. And it was so hard to argue because it's so complex.
But so if you signed something saying you wouldn't tell the media.
Later on, it's used as evidence in court, so it becomes a public document.
Open.
So I'm not.
I was going to say
breaching any undertaking that I made.
We hopefully have people listening.
Yes. So it subsequently is in the public domain. You can probably Google it and get it now.
Okay.
But I mean, it's a very complex scientific document. It's not. It's
easy reading.
Yeah, because it goes into detail about hemosiderin and about you've got to if you're trying to work of the heart and work out something, and I can't even remember now. So
okay.
Yeah.
See, I hear things like that, and I just think how very wrong it is not to disclose, not to. Like to delay the coroner's report. Those things are not just a miscarriage of justice. To me, that's deliberate malice towards the accused.
Sure. I mean, it's one way to look at it. I'm not sure that's what I think that the Solicitor General felt he was under no legal duty to disclose, and so he doesn't.
I know, but as a human, how can you read something like that exonerates a serving a life sentence?
Okay, it doesn't of itself exonerate him. Okay. It calls into question the scientific evidence that was put before the jury, and and may have changed the course of the trial. I think probably absolutely would have, and was subsequently used by the appeal court to say the conviction should be quashed. So
was that only part of the reason they quashed it, or was it the reason they quashed it?
That was part. It was a big part of it, because that was so the other expert evidence used in that final appeal was all the experts that tonight had been kind enough to pay to do reports, and so it was all about you couldn't actually murder her by lifting her legs, and you can't age the bruising, and so there was a lot of other material, but it was very powerful on the court in that it was somebody who was completely disconnected with Henry Kio, who came in at the request of the then Solicitor General, and was a very well credentialed scientist.
All right, well, I don't want to malign the now Chief Justice, but I think it's troubling.
It is troubling.
And actually, sorry, you keep going. I have a question once you've finished.
No, far away. Give us a question.
Well, no, I want to hear the end of the story and then I have a question.
Right. So the end of the story is after I was only then I appeared once in the South Australian courts. I was then really a researcher. I should give a shout out to Mari Shaw, KC, and Sam Abbott, SC, the two barristers who ended up running the case. They were unbelievable. And to work with Mari Shaw, who's a senior silk down in South Australia, just what an experience. Such a brilliant lawyer. I was then just a researcher in the background. They'd call me up and say, can you look up this? Can you write and draft something on this? And so I wasn't really involved in the hard fought. So what happens, the appeal court says, conviction quashed, retrial ordered. They actually go, okay, we're going to retry him. And they let him out of jail and set it down for retrial.
What? And
then, but they pull out. Because the guy because Colin Manock then has dementia and can't give evidence, and the chief scientist who'd given the report, he I think had passed away or was also too old to give evidence.
Right.
So they wanted to attack that chief scientist's report.
Oh my goodness! But so that means he's not found innocent.
Conviction quashed. He is innocent until proven guilty, like the rest of us.
Oh, okay.
So he, but he never had his retrial. And they then say we're not going to retry. But what then happens is it becomes a bit of a political thing that the Labor government that had been in power for years and years and years and had taken a real set against Henry Kio at an election, the Conservatives said, if we get into power, we're going to give compensation to Henry Kio, or come into power, immediately give him compensation.
Wow.
Even though he wasn't technically innocent. Or, he
wasn't found not guilty.
Yeah. And then that becomes a big political issue. And anyway, but he got compensation, which I think he richly deserved. And I do want to say this before you ask your question. I've represented a number of people in miscarriage of justice cases, and Graham Stafford being one of them, who was a lovely man and a gentleman. Henry Kio, I've met him a couple of times, and I corresponded with him and spoke to him on the phone a fair bit. Every year I get a Christmas card from him, and it's been, almost 10 years since, and I really appreciate that.
But was it Keogh who spoke to one of my students on the phone?
It was, yes. He does favours for me every now and then.
She was doing a journalism article and he gave an hour of his time to her, and she said he was just lovely.
He's an absolute gentleman, and I really appreciate that he still remembers that.
And so my question is, so obviously I want to come back to the life insurance.
Yeah.
So obviously they weren't going to pay him if he's convicted of murdering Anna.
Yeah.
But if he's not guilty anymore, does he get the payout for all of those insurance policies he paid for?
No, because do you know what the Anashini's parents got them? They paid out to her parents.
Okay, so they were paid out.
Yes, paid out to her parents.
Because I was going to say that's a lot of insurance policies with no return.
Yes. So I should give a shout out to Graham Archer, who was the producer of Today Tonight through that time. He's now retired. He is, again, just such a brilliant man. He wrote the book, one of the books on Henry Kio, called Unmaking a Murderer. And it's definitely worth a read. Not just because it mentions me in the book, but also because he gives a really good readable summary of how this, Gordian knot of a wrongful conviction was untied.
It is. So we talk about, your kid disappearing in the night being a parent's worst nightmare. But to me, for a spouse to come home and find your partner dead in the house with, you've got no idea of what's happened, and then you go to jail for all of those years for it, knowing you didn't do it. That is literally just
your worst nightmare.
The worst nightmare.
Yeah.
Because you're dealing with the grief and the loss, and then also the charges and your loss of liberty and the suspicions and everyone treating you differently.
Yeah.
And he deserved a huge compensation payout.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, good work, Joe.
Well, I wasn't involved in it by that stage. I just was involved in a small part of it, but it was a very interesting case to be involved in. So, yeah. Well,
I'm pleased for Kio. And my questions at the start were just, preliminary questions. I have no doubt that he was innocent.
All right. Well, I hope your student enjoys that Kio case.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we'll get some feedback through some good reviews.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you for listening to the episode. If you enjoyed it, please rate and review or like and subscribe. It all helps Lizzie and I keep this podcast going.
If you're interested in clips, you can look at them on Instagram and TikTok. Just search for Justice Matters Pod. See you next episode.